Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War news update for the 28th of January 2024. I'd normally be out at my son's rugby match, but my partner's, the good news is my partner's taken him. Bad news is she's given me the lurgy. So a bit rough today. I don't know what that effect will have on my output. Nonetheless, we'll start with what looks like a fairly quick first video. There's not too much information to impart. Here are the general staff figures for the Ukrainians, the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats apply, and you can find them in the description to this video below. 740 personnel lost is somewhere in the middle of the range that we expect at the moment. In fact, you can almost say that 740 seems fairly low, comparatively speaking. We've got up as far as 1,380 personnel lost in a single day previously, relatively recently. So it's interesting that 740 now seems like it's at the lower end, but actually in terms of what we've expected throughout the entire war, where we were having, many weeks of 300 or so personnel being lost, 740 is, not insignificant. 9 tanks, obviously you always remember these are people we are referring to. 9 tanks, 19 APVs and 12 artillery systems in those categories are, there or thereabouts, fairly average for tanks and armed personnel vehicles compared to the averages over the course of the war. 12 artillery pieces is a little bit lower, I think, than the average, but actually, still that's going to hurt the Russians somewhat. We see that there are 31 vehicles and fuel tanks there. That's fairly significant loss of things like civilian vehicles, trucks, and so on and so forth. Civilian vehicles, of course, used for Russian purposes, military purposes, and 3 pieces of special equipment. So we're going to look at Andrew Perpetua's loss statistics for the day before, and you can see that there are some huge losses for the Russians here. The ratio is about, that's going to be 5 to 1. Maybe 6 to 1, some there or thereabouts, which is a huge issue for the Russians. Just a caveat to add here, a bunch of vehicles here were from Avdiivka and Novomykhailivka, says Perpetua. A large number were noted and logged and geolocated, but never listed as a loss because we never had photo or video and just high-res satellite images. A few more were unknown. Also, a few were in the high-res satellite images hiding and only found them due to photos. I found like 70 vehicles near Novomykhailivka on my first look, but found like 12 more since hiding between trees, etc. In other words, I'm not sure if all of these are losses from the last 24 hours, and so you got to bear that in mind. He previously has indicated that he doesn't add old losses to these lists, as in, when Oryx or War Spotting might find something that was lost in, I don't know, March last year. You're not going to add it to this, but I guess it is because these are relatively recent ones that have happened in the attacks on Novomykhailivka, in the attacks on Avdiivka that have happened over the last couple of months, and so it could be that's still relevant to include for Andrew. We look at the Ukrainian losses: a boat, piece of artillery, a couple of pieces of artillery taken out by Lancets. They are still being a thorn in the side for the Ukrainians. And then a couple that's noted from the counteroffensive but unmapped. So it does actually tell you at the side whether they are old. So you could, if you want, take those 2 out and the stats will look worse. But of course, some of these Russian ones are old as well. So really not a lot lost by the Ukrainians there. No real high value pieces of equipment. Now, when we come and look at the Russian losses, there's a Strela 10 that I think I showed you the video, or I referenced the video to that yesterday. Then we have an electronic warfare bit of equipment at VS5, which is apparently one of the newest bits of electronic warfare equipment taken out. And then some surveillance and comms equipment as well. Engineering vehicle. And then look at the artillery here. We have 6 Grads. These are multiple launch rocket systems, obviously found on one piece of a montage bit of footage taken out by artillery, which is interesting because I've been saying recently most of the documented losses here from Andrew skew towards being drone lost as a result of drone activity, first-person view drones or drones dropping bombs. We have, what else do we have? A range of tanks, really, T-80s, T-72s, some unknowns, but quite a lot of tanks. 2 previously documented, 1 old but unmapped. But the rest of those actually appear to be so that's only 3 out of those tanks, and you've got, I don't know, a dozen tanks there. So the Russians have lost a number, quite a high number, in the last couple of days. And then when we look at the infantry fighting vehicles, BMP-2s, BMP-1s, a few other ones as well, and APCs, MTLBs, some of these are previously documented but now properly verified, and then some of these will be from yesterday. Trucks and civilian vehicles. I mean, the end result is there's an awful lot of equipment that the Russians have lost. And we go back to the same old discussion that we have, which is at these rates, the Russians will become, I like to say become unstuck. I always think that's the wrong way of saying it. They will become stuck. At some point soon, Andrew was talking about this being, 8 months' time, the Russians will have no equipment left. But there'll be a tipping point where you get to a point where you don't have the requisite equipment to commit to any meaningful maneuvers. How soon will that be? Is that now? Are we seeing the Russians stop in places like Avdiivka? When I say stop, I mean, start doing more infantry-led attacks because they don't have the equipment, because it has been attrited. Where are we at different places on the front line in terms of Russian losses? There have just been huge losses that are continued, and there's no way of arguing around this. Like, you can be a pro-Russian in my threads, but you are arguing with visually confirmed data that shows that the Russians are losing an overwhelmingly large amount of equipment compared to the Ukrainians. Now, you can ask why that would be. Is it the Ukrainians just aren't taking equipment close to the front lines, and so the Russians are using drones against dugouts and trenches because there just isn't the equipment there? I think there's certainly going to be something in that. So the Ukrainians are in a defensive mode. They're not going to be committing, their best tanks and infantry fighting vehicles across the front line. Whereas the Russians are in this period where they are attacking. This is a kind of an offensive phase, and so they are going to be committing much more equipment, but they are losing it, and there's just no two ways about it. And Andrew Perpetua talks about how he tries to look for Ukrainian losses on Russian social media. He looks at 2/3 Russian sources compared to Ukrainian sources, and still this is what he finds. This is not a good look for the Russians, and it just shows that they are in trouble. And this is, remember, a period where Ukraine are really bloody suffering for resources. They desperately need artillery ammunition. They desperately need equipment that is not forthcoming as a result of the $60-odd billion package from the US that they were expecting but not receiving, and now other nations are trying to pick up the slack, but still they are doing this. I mean, it's remarkable. I think we need to remember what a remarkable job the Ukrainians do. I'm not trying to be positive here. I'm just, you look at the data that comes in, not so much the general staff figures. They are staggering losses. There are staggering losses for the Russians here, but if you disbelieve that, it's much harder to argue against verified evidence of destroyed and damaged and abandoned equipment that we're seeing on a daily basis. And then when you add the other pieces of jigsaw to that, I shared this with you yesterday in a frontline update, but I think it's worth going over again today. So this is a Russian military reporter admitting major losses of their combat equipment. How sustainable this is unclear, says Dmitry from War Translated. The translation from this Russian mill blogger is, they often write, of course, that I exaggerate the number of damaged vehicles. So this is a Russian that is a bit of a realist, but gets attacked by pro-Kremlin voices for being that realist. But this is just one of the intersections of tree lines in the Avdiivka area, and there are dozens of such places. What's he talking about? Well, actually, he's talking about this image. So this image alone, he says this is just one intersection of tree lines where you can see, at the top left of the picture, there's one. Then we come down 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So in that one image, you have 10 vehicles destroyed. Just absolutely insane. And so when we start looking at the Andrew Perpetua loss list and the Ukrainian general staff figures, you start thinking, yeah, they are that is what's happening. As I already wrote, he says, the Ukrainian Armed Forces tactics for the year are the maximum destruction of our equipment and personnel. We're going to come on to this in a second. Being of the defensive and retreating to the next positions if holding the old positions can lead to large losses. This will allow them to balance the equipment ratio by next year. This is active defense where territory is not important. What's important for the Ukrainians at the moment, unless it's like a very, very strategically, operationally, tactically important piece of ground or a settlement or whatever, then essentially land is land. What you want to do is attrit the Russian forces to the point where they can't continue to advance 6 months down the line. Right, and that's what the Ukrainians are doing. So anyway, this will allow them to balance the equipment ratio by next year and will also give them time to build new lines of defense. But what am I talking about? The Ukrainian front is cracking and we continue to attack powerfully and stronger. Brackets irony. In other words, we don't do that. We are not, the Ukrainian front is not cracking and we are not attacking powerfully and we are not attacking stronger and stronger. So this is a Russian realist saying the Ukrainian strategy appears to be succeeding. It appears to be trying to get those ratios, those continued ratios, meaning that at some point it's going to be a day of reckoning for the Russian forces. Okay. Let's move on, just look at a few other bits of the jigsaw. Now, remember, there are going to be Russian bits of footage out there that I haven't come across, my own selection bias, whereby, Ukrainian stuff is getting blown up, of course. This is a Magyar publishing footage. He's operating predominantly down in the Krinky area, the Magyar's birds, the drone units that he has working there. A massive explosion of Russian ammo stock in Krinky on the 27th of January, saying Worms will have no ammo to shoot tonight. This is obviously huge. That kind of hitting of the logistics is massively important to allow the Ukrainians to get a bit of a breather in that area, which is particularly tough. Magyar's drone units are one of the main components of the Ukrainian activities around Krinky that allow those soldiers to maintain that bridgehead. Incredibly dangerous. They're sacrificing themselves, really, so that the Russians can be fixed and attrited in the ratios that are advantageous to the Ukrainians. So that is another piece of the jigsaw around there. Here we have Dmitry from War Translated again saying Russian military reporter describes an interesting FPV, first-person view drone tactic. Ukrainians place drones on a road, watch the cameras, and once they notice the incoming vehicle, they raise the drone and let the car drive into it. The Ukrainians, well, I probably don't need to read it to you, but I will. It started laying down FPVs on the road in our direction and are operating by headlights. Today, we talked about this with Sukhoi. You're going to work on a mission and they look through the camera and raise the drone in front of the vehicle so you drive into it yourself, and that's it. We need mobile electronic warfare so there will be a higher chance of survival. So that is... We've heard a number of different tactics being used. And of course, when the Ukrainians use these tactics, the Russians will pick up on that and use it themselves in the same way that you Russians are using tactics that the Ukrainians will be like looking at and go, oh yeah, that's good, we'll have that. So there's other ones where they just fly the drones into a position that's kind of tactically useful and just park the drone there and wait for the right moment to then lift the drone up and attack whatever it is, a kind of sort of an ambush situation. Anyway, Russian repair shop has been hit here. Heavy military vehicle repair shop has been struck by Ukrainian missiles. According to the source, 6 Russians were injured in the strike. Time and location are not provided, so I don't know where that is. But when we hear about explosions in Berdyansk, explosions in Mariupol, explosions here, and you think, right, HIMARS have been working, this is a kind of result. And then when you see on that, so all of those vehicles in that repair shop might well now be added to the general staff list, and you're thinking, goodness me, where have all these vehicles come from? Well, this is just one strike on one day, and you've got multiple vehicles being taken out. So yeah, things are challenging for the Russians in terms of vehicle losses. Now, what else has been going on? Partisans have been active in Novokakhovka, so that's on the Dnipro River where the dam was. A local channel reports 2, possibly 3 attacks on vehicles used by the occupiers in the town, in the occupied part of Kherson region. First video was in the Sokol area of the town. So partisan activity. Second blast, occupied Novokakhovka shows a big vehicle exploding near the ATB supermarket in Sokol. And then he goes on to say a bit later, update from Novokakhovka, seems first-person view drones carried out the attacks on the occupiers' vehicles. That's led some locals in the town in Kherson region to suggest it may have been friendly fire between different racial segments of Russia's army. So who knows whether it's partisans or infighting between different factions within the Russian army there. Nonetheless, it's all good for the Ukrainians, right? If there's that kind of activity taking place behind the lines. And Russia on fire, a theatre of satire is burning in Moscow. So another fire in kind of in the middle of Moscow. Not good news for the Russians there. Right, now we're moving on to distant strikes, standoff munitions, etc., etc. Overnight, 4 out of 8 Shahed drones were shot down. So that's 50% rate. That's not the best, is it? But of course, there's only 8. And again, it's this question, why so few? In addition, 2 Iskander-M and 3 S-300 missiles were fired, of which the damage is being determined. These are ballistic missiles that are very difficult to shoot down. So it looks like all 5 of those missiles were not intercepted, which is not surprising. So that I don't know where these have hit and what the damage has been. So I guess we'll have to wait and see with that. Yuri says 900 high-precision missiles remain in service in Russia, and Russia manages to produce around 100 missiles per month. The occupiers also have S-300 and anti-ship missiles located in Crimea. It's a situation like, why are they not firing missiles? And if they are producing 100 a month, then they're firing 100 a month, and that might sound like a lot. Compared to last year, that's not a lot. 100 a month is, on average, sort of 3 1/3 a day. So it means that, you might have 40 on one day in a month, 40 2 weeks later, and then 20 2 weeks later. And you compare that sort of fire rate to at the height of the missile attacks and drone attacks last year, and that is not as good. So I think the Russians have taken a hit in production, and we are seeing that in their lack of usage over this time period. Right, the consequences of a Russian attack on an industrial facility. This was doing the rounds yesterday. These images, it's hard to see what the scale is here. I don't quite. This picture doesn't really tell me a lot, but it obviously looks pretty bad. But is that 10 square meters, 100 square meters? I don't know. Consequences of a Russian attack on an industrial facility in the Kremenchuk district. Previously, 2 ballistic missiles, reports Poltava Regional Military Administration. There is currently no information about victims. All necessary emergency services are on site. So, I don't know what was hit, but it's an industrial facility. Could have been part of the military-industrial complex, and obviously that's going to be a problem for the Ukrainians. It's a strategy that the Russians have adopted more this year rather than last year, where they're hitting the energy infrastructure. Now it's the Ukrainians' ability to produce weapons. Kenneth Gregg here, the Finnish fighter who has been in Ukraine now doing a lot of charity work. I haven't referred to him for a long time, but here, as part of his whole thread of what's going on the front lines and this and that, I thought this was interesting, and I can't verify this. He says our forces have received an effective electronic weapon against Shahed drones. This is true, as far as I can work out. We have seen a number of Shahed drones fall from the sky, as in they have landed undestroyed on the ground. It appeared to have fallen out of the sky due to electronic warfare, and there's talk that the Ukrainians now have a greater electronic warfare capability for both missiles and drones of this size, and this is incredibly significant. He says the drones simply glide to the ground, usually completely intact. They are then, this is a part that, so we know that, this is a part that I've wondered about previously. He's made the claim, but take it with a pinch of salt. I have no evidence that this is true. Then they are reprogrammed and returned to the sender. Now, that would be brilliant if they could, there's only limited damage to these, they can fix them up and then send them back. That would be brilliant. According to Reuters, a petroleum product refinery near Sochi that was hit by Ukrainian drones a few days ago has stopped production. The repairs are expected to take months. Now, I don't think those two things are connected. I think it was a Beaver drones that hit that Tuapse oil refinery. However, this is something I'd love to look into, whether electronic warfare can mean that they can reuse the fallen Shahed drones. Right, then we're going on to other bits and pieces, and we'll refer back to what we were talking about before in terms of what the Ukrainian strategy now is. And I talked about this in my frontline update, so I'll be going over it again, but I think it is super important because this is what's going to happen over the next, arguably in the next year. So the Wall Street Washington Post has produced an article which is being summarized here, but in the Euromaidan press, that new US plans aims to strengthen Ukraine military by 2024, not retake land. This is exactly correct in my opinion, and this is basically what their strategy has been to differing degrees since the beginning of the counteroffensive. So that Malatok Machka, lose a bunch of Bradleys and Leopards very quickly and realize that the minefields, the ATGMs, the fortifications, the Ka-52 attack helicopters and the massive artillery barrages would mean that they aren't going to take 30 kilometers in a day and they aren't going to get to Tokmak. Okay, once that was realized, the Ukrainians sat back, adopted more of a active defense platform to fundamentally attrit the Russian artillery, air defenses, and all their mechanized equipment. And that has been, I think, incredibly successful. So if you look at the Russian losses since, you could say since May, and we have done that, and Dell does the stats that you can find in the description below. So he compiles all the, Ukrainian General Staff stats. And you can look at the vast numbers of pieces of equipment that have been lost since May and that have been continuing now. With the Russians attacking, the Ukrainians can sit back on active defense and just soak up that pressure, concede some territory, but most importantly, destroy Russian equipment and, of course, personnel. This is looking at the idea that the Americans have said, no, you're not going to take land. Land is not important at the moment. Remember, this fits entirely with what I've said previously, where you've got a hierarchy of needs. Land is the least important need at the moment, but it's the most important thing overall. That's a weird situation. Okay, so at the top of the hierarchy of objectives, you have take back all your territory. Yeah, of course. But you can't do that until you do this level of objectives first, which is attrit artillery, attrit air defense, attrit personnel, attrit armored personnel vehicles, attrit tanks, attrit, etc., etc. You take all that equipment out, and then eventually the Russians have nothing, equipment and personnel, they have nothing, and then you take the territory back. But territory at the moment, you can lose territory now, and it will enable you to win it back with greater ease later. So you lose territory because you don't want to lose your own troops and equipment. You concede your territory, but you have to attrit the opposition. So you attrit the Russians while conceding territory, so that the Russians get to a point where it effectively looks like a Pyrrhic victory for them, where they've taken land, but they've exhausted themselves, and then the Ukrainians go, right, are you ready? Okay, thank you very much. Now you have nothing left, and we'll just slowly take all our land back because you've exhausted your equipment. So the new approach, this article says, aims to strengthen Ukraine's military in the long run rather than win back land in the near future. Quote, the idea now to position Ukraine to hold its position on the battlefield for now, but put them on a different trajectory to be much stronger by the end of 2024 and get them on a more sustainable path, an official said. The new strategy, the Washington Post writes, differs sharply from last year's approach when the US and allies rushed equipment to Kiev and trained soldiers hoping to help push back the Russian forces that occupied eastern and southern Ukraine. However, the plan failed, mainly due to the heavily fortified minefields and trenches on the front line on the Russian side, the publication notes. It's pretty clear that it will be difficult for them to try and mount the same kind of major push on all fronts that they tried to do last year, a senior administration official said, according to the Washington Post. So I feel kind of sort of vindicated here because this is basically what I've been talking about for the last however many months, right? The US document outlines support in 4 phases. 1, fight. 2, build. 3, recover. 4, reform. The fight phase focuses on providing more ammunition, drones, and air defense, including additional air defense to create protective bubbles around Ukrainian cities beyond Kyiv and Odessa. The build phase pledges future security aid to develop a highly deterrent Ukrainian military. The strategy also aims to allow key parts of the Ukrainian economy and exports, including steel and agriculture, to recover. In 2024, the US hopes Ukraine will avoid losing further territory to Russia's occupation of 1/5 of the country. The Western countries, the Washington Post writes, want Kiev to focus on tactics that have been more successful recently. In other words, conducting long-range fire, containing the Black Sea Fleet, and tying down Russian forces inside Crimea using missile strikes and sabotage. So what you want to see, if you're Ukrainian, is the allied nations and their own indigenous production to provide Ukraine with strike capabilities in terms of Storm Shadow cruise missiles, ATACMS, HIMARS, all of that stuff, and lots of it. Like I've said previously, goodness me, what you want is give the Ukrainians another 30 HIMARS vehicles, another 2,000 HIMARS rockets, and then go for it. Just blitz everything. You're not sending a single man into the front line to be attrited. Just absolutely have at it. Here's all the ATACMS you can poke a hairy stick at. Here are Storm Shadows or Taurus. Just all of that stuff, and just missile the heck out of the Russians. And you won't lose any Ukrainian soldiers, but you'll absolutely decimate the Russian capability to do war. Like, that's what I would do. And, you know, it seems like this is part of the strategy. But, you know, that's what they should have done for the last 6 months, you know, exclusively. Anyway, it finishes. The strategy aims to future-proof aid against a Trump win, but some question shifting focus from sending maximum weapons now. Quote, you cannot win a war by pursuing an incremental step-by-step approach, said former NATO chief Anders Fogh Rasmussen. The Washington Post writes, I mean, goodness, you need to do everything. They need everything now rather than incremental, oh, we'll give you this and we'll give you this. Have everything now, and then you can form your strategies to best achieve your goals. Like, rather than not knowing what your strategy is going to be because you don't have the equipment. This is the kind of chicken and egg scenario where people like Mike Johnson, as I've said many times before, are demanding a strategy before you let Ukraine know what weapons they can have and give them any weapons. Whereas Ukraine is going, we can't form a strategy if we don't know what weapons we have access to. If we don't know the schedule of weapons, how can we produce a strategy? Like, what's our strategy? Go and hit them with pitchforks? Like, until we know what we've got, we can't form a plan. And so this is the issue. And Mike Johnson keeps saying that and keeps going, well, you know, we've told you we want a strategy before we give you a clear strategy. And the Ukrainians are like, dude, understand how to strategize. You go and watch Anders Puck Nelson's video on that. Anyway, just one other piece of other news to give you. Another close call for Russia's airlines. An S-7 plane, like the one here, with 160 passengers on board, tried to take off from Ulan-Ude, bound for Moscow, even though the engine was known to be faulty from an inspection. Pilots aborted takeoff during acceleration on the runway. Just, more evidence that the civil aviation industry in Russia is really, really suffering. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. It does make an awful lot of difference. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Toodle pips.